What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video, and today we're going to be discussing the magicka sorcerer again. This time we're going to be discussing a non-pet builds specifically, and we're going to be talking about Julianos versus Netch's Touch. Now these two sets have kind of been floated around as best in slot options for non-pet sorcs. The idea being that sorcerers have a lot of damage coming in that is shock damage, so Netch's Touch seems like it would be a better choice. However, there's been a lot of people also recommending Julianos because Julianos doesn't just boost your shock damage, it boosts all of your spell damage regardless of elemental type. So today we're just going to kind of go over which one actually is better from a mathematical standpoint. We're going to be doing a few parses to kind of show the numbers behind it, just kind of back up the math, so to speak. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So for those of you guys who don't know the set bonuses for Julianos, Julianos is a crafted set. You can get it from Rothgar. It requires 6 traits in order for you to craft it. It has the following set abilities. For the 2-piece, it adds spell crit. The 3-piece is max magicka. The 4-piece is spell crit, and the 5-piece adds 299 spell damage. Now, Netch's Touch, on the other hand, Netch's Touch comes from Darkshade Caverns. You can do it either on 1 or 2. Blue quality pieces drop from normal, and purple quality pieces drop from vet. Ideally, you're going to have this in armor, so you can just run Darkshade Caverns on normal to get the pieces you want. These are the set effects here on the right hand side. It's 2 pieces spell crit, 3 pieces max magicka, 4 piece is spell damage, and a 5 piece adds 400 spell damage to your shock damage abilities. So clearly, we're just going to quickly go over the kind of ups and downs of each set. So Julianos is a crafted set, which is a huge plus on its part. It's pretty easy to obtain. It only requires 6 traits, so you can, if you don't have it, you can ask a guild member to craft it for you, and many people are willing to craft Julianos for you as long as you provide materials and you know, style mats if you want a rarer style like Magsorc or Bloodforge, for example. So Julianos is a lot easier to obtain and gives you more customizability. If you don't want to use a costume, you can kind of create a character look however you'd like, and the fact that it is crafted means that you can go with a heavy chest for some added resistances as well. It's not that much, but every little bit kind of counts in event trials. And then you compare that to Netch's Touch, which requires a lot of farming. Basically, you have to go to Darkshade Caverns, you have to farm for the pieces, and you have to hope you get them in Divines. Now, with the introduction of Transmutation in Clockwork City, getting the perfect trait is not necessarily the end goal. Like, you don't need to, you know, throw away a sturdy belt, for instance. You can transmute that into Divines. However, that does involve grinding for those crystals. That's kind of the downside of using Netch's Touch. You do have to farm for it versus Julianos, which you can just craft it, and you can craft it in the traits that you want. So if you want all pieces in Divines, it's pretty easy. You just have to provide the sapphires in order to get Divines pieces. Compare that to Netch's Touch, where you're going to need to hopefully get lucky and get those Divines pieces to drop. So just in terms of how long it takes to obtain these sets, Julianos is by and far the easier set to obtain and the more accessible set. So now we want to compare Julianos and Netch. So the big piece is going to be coming from the 4 and 5 piece, because those two set effects are different. On Julianos you get spell crit, on Netch's Touch you get spell damage. And the 5-piece, Julianos gives you 299 spell damage, while Netch's Touch gives you 400 shock damage. 400 spell damage to your shock damage abilities. So why does this matter? So you want to make sure that spell crit might outweigh the extra spell damage that you get. 833 spell crit, it works out to be roughly, and this is just kind of an approximation, it's roughly 3.8, 3.7% extra crit. So the question is, does that extra crit chance you know, does that outparse this extra added 129 spell damage that you get? And as for the 5-piece, you kind of need to wonder what percentage of your DPS is coming from shock damage abilities, because Netch's Touch does not affect for example, magic damage, fire damage, or frost damage, all of which are potential sources of damage on a Magsorc. So the kind of threshold that you're going to want to get to hit, let's just swap over to our calculator real quick. So this is kind of how you can determine whether or not a set is worth running over Julianos. So you want to compare Julianos and the Netch's Touch. So we have 299 spell damage, that comes from Julianos. Now you want to know the percentage DPS needs to come from shock damage in order for Netch's Touch to outperform Julianos. So you want to divide that by the 400 the spell damage you get to shock damage abilities. Then obviously multiply that, so that gives you the proportion. So you need to do about 75% of your damage needs to come from shock damage in order for Netch's Touch to match Julianos. So more than 75% needs to come from shock damage if you want it to outperform Julianos. That's kind of the threshold that you have to meet. If you're doing something like 60-70% of your damage is coming from shock damage, then Julianos overall is going to give you a better bang for your buck, just speaking from the 5-piece. This isn't considering the 4-piece, whether or not the extra crit outweighs the spell damage part of Netch's Touch. And that's kind of where things kind of fall into play. So, you know, Magsorcs have a lot of shock damage coming in. Liquid Lightning, Blockade of Storms, your light attacks are shock damage, your heavy attacks are shock damage. It does not boost the pet pulse, which is why it's not recommended for pet builds. Pet damage is scaled almost solely on max magicka. It doesn't scale very well on spell damage, so that's why Netch's Touch, you don't really find that being used on pet builds. Of course, it also boosts your Lambrus proc, and it boosts the shock damage portion of Crushing Shock or Force Pulse. Now what it doesn't boost is the flame damage and the frost damage part of Crushing Shock. It doesn't boost Crystal Frags, that's magic damage. Haunting Curse and Daedric Prey is also magic damage, so it doesn't boost that. And if you're using Shooting Star instead of Elemental Rage on your back bar, it doesn't boost Shooting Star either, because that is all flame damage. So in order for Netch to outperform Juli, we're going to need to ensure that at least 75% of our damage is coming from shock damage abilities. So we're going to do a quick parse here. This one is going to be with Julianos, and then we're going to do a parse with Netch's Touch, and we're going to go ahead and see which one actually outperforms the other. A little bit of lag there. Oh yeah, that's a huge lag spike right there. Alright, so that is the Julianos parse right here. And so, just from this parse alone, we're going to be able to kind of get an idea of whether or not Netch's Touch is going to start outperforming Julianos. So, we're going to head over now to our calculator again. And we're going to figure out just how much of our damage came from shock damage. So our light attacks, going off screen here, 17.7% came from light attacks, 15.2 came from liquid lightning, 11.4, and we're just going to keep going down the line. This comes from Lambrus. This comes from heavy attack, Mage's Wrath. Implosion is affected by it. Okay, let's add that all together. So 73.7% of our DPS came from shock damage, and solely shock damage. So as you can see, it's actually quite close. So in this example, it doesn't seem like Netch is actually going to outperform Julianos. Now do keep in mind, I did use Shooting Star as my ultimate. If I was going to use Thunderous Rage again, that might change, in which case the scales will tip in favor of Netch's touch, because now we're losing out on the Shooting Star DPS, which, just looking at combat metrics, makes up 3.8% of our DPS. So we're losing 3.8%, and assuming that all of that goes back into Thunderous Rage, now we're over 75% threshold. But will that actually hold up in practice? So I did have a lag spike in that parse there, so that could have affected our results a little bit. So what we're going to do now is we're going to swap out Julianos for Netch's Touch, and we're going to see whether or not Netch's matches, at the very least, are Julianos parse. Now do keep in mind the 4-piece effect could make or break the difference here, because when we're looking at percentage of DPS coming out, we're just looking at the 5-piece, we're not taking into consideration the 4-piece. The 129 spell damage might actually start weighing Netch's Touch over Julianos. It all depends on the crit factor. 833 spell crit, like I said earlier, is about 3.6 to 3.8 spell crit, so does that crit outweigh the spell damage we get? Let's find out. Alright, so that is the Netch's Touch parse, about 32k. If we take a jump back at our Julianos parse, it's not actually that big of a difference. You can pretty much chalk it up to just within margin of error there. So you can see here that it did end up coming pretty close, just like we predicted. Netch's Touch does seem to more or less match Julianos blow for blow. The extra spell damage does not outweigh the extra crit, and vice versa on either set. So just taking a quick look at our combat metrics parse here, just looking at where all of our damage is coming in, we can see that a lot of our DPS just increased overall. So if you see here, Liquid Lightning did 16.4% on the Netch versus 15.2 on Julianos, and that's all to be expected. So all of our lightning hits ended up going up, while everything else kind of went down or stayed relatively the same. So now, like I said again, I was using Shooting Star for this parse. If we ended up using Thunderous Rage, that might tip the scales in favor of Netch's Touch. So if you see here, Shooting Star at 2.8 plus 0.6, so that's 3.4. So again, if we add that 3.4, assuming all of that goes into Thunderous Rage, then all of a sudden Netch's Touch becomes slightly stronger than Julianos, just looking at the 5-piece. So overall, our conclusion will be that it doesn't really matter which set you choose, Julianos or Netch, on a non-pet build, assuming you're using a Lightning Staff front bar, not an Inferno Staff front bar. So I would recommend sticking with Julianos. It's just easier, it's so much easier to obtain. All you have to do is ask in a trading guild that you're in, or one of your social guilds. You know, just ask somebody, hey, can you make a set of Julianos for me? I just need it in Divine, CP 160, this is the style, I have all the mats. And more likely than not, somebody will be willing to make the set for you. You might even get it for free. All you have to do is just provide mats. So my recommendation is going to be full-heartedly Julianos, just so you don't have to farm for ages for those Netch's Touch pieces. But if you do have a set Netch's Touch and you don't want to use Julianos, then by all means go ahead and use Netch's Touch. So that's it for this video. Hope you found it informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.